The owls came at breakfast, and Percy Weasley watched them. He had watched Morning Post since his first year at Hogwarts, 4 years now, and in that time, the ritual had become as familiar to him as everything else he had catalogued about this school. Hundreds of owls dropping through the high windows, the candles swaying in the rush of wings, letters and packages falling into waiting hands while students made whatever sounds people made when they received love from a distance. Percy did not find it embarrassing. He found it instructive. You could tell a great deal about a person from how they behaved at Morning Post, and Percy believed in telling a great deal about people because knowing things accurately was the foundation of doing things correctly. He was 15 now, with a prefect badge pinned to his robes and a screech owl of his own, and the Great Hall in the morning was his to survey in a way it had not been before. Not officially, Morning Post was not technically prefect jurisdiction, but a prefect who understood his role only through the written handbook was a prefect who had failed to grasp the position at its root. The handbook was a floor. Percy lived on the ceiling. He ate his breakfast efficiently and watched. The first years were at the far end of the Gryffindor table. Percy had escorted them from the boats on the first night, one of the listed duties, one of his favorites, because it was useful and visible and he could do it correctly. And he had kept the line orderly on the path up from the lake, and he had answered the questions worth answering, and he had catalogued their faces because he would need to know them. His brother Ron was one of them, which was its own complication. Ron was 11 and taller than Percy had expected, and still fundamentally himself despite the fact of Hogwarts, which Percy found simultaneously reassuring and mildly embarrassing. Ron had not lasted 20 minutes on the Hogwarts Express before forming an attachment to Harry Potter, a fact Percy had been informed of in the first letter home and the second and the third, and which Percy filed under family matters requiring no professional intervention. He was not immune to Potter himself, if he was honest, which he was, always, with himself if not always with others. Harry Potter was a name Percy had grown up with before he knew what it described, part of the war's ending, part of the large facts of wizarding history that adults discussed somewhere quieter than children's rooms. Percy had decided before September that the correct approach was to treat Potter like any other first-year student, which he believed to be the non-sycophantic position. He had noted the scar, which was smaller than he'd somehow imagined, and the round glasses, and the dark untidy hair, and the fact that the boy was thin in a way Percy had filed away and then found himself returning to without quite meaning to. On the first morning of classes, the owls descended on the Great Hall, and Percy watched, and Harry Potter received nothing. He filed this away. Not every family wrote daily. Percy had written home on his very first morning at Hogwarts, but he was aware that this was not a universal standard. By the third morning, it was still unremarkable. Percy told himself this quite deliberately. The pattern established itself over September. The old Weasley post owl, grey-feathered and reliable in the way of things that had lasted past their expected life, came to Ron almost every day. Letters from their mother, packages wrapped in brown paper, once a howler that detonated in the second week with sufficient volume to make the Ravenclaw table look up. Ron received these things and ate the biscuits and wrote back, and the correspondence moved in both directions, and the system worked. Percy watched it work. Harry Potter sat beside Ron every morning and received nothing. There was no visible distress. This was what Percy noted. The boy came to breakfast and ate and talked to Ron and paid attention to the post the way you paid attention to weather, acknowledging it without expecting anything from it. He had the posture of someone who had not developed the reflex of looking up when the owls came, because looking up had never rewarded him. This was, Percy told himself, not a thing he was going to continue thinking about. He continued thinking about it. He told himself in the third week of September that this fell within his professional scope. Student welfare was his concern. A student who showed no visible distress, who performed well in his classes, who had managed to make a friend in his first week, was not a student who required intervention. Percy was not planning to intervene. He was noticing, which was different, because noticing was his job, and the thing he had noticed was a structural fact about the room that was true every morning. The first year who sat at his brother's elbow had no one sending him anything. He kept watching. October arrived, and the grounds went amber, and still nothing landed at Harry Potter's place at the table. Percy had counted the weeks, and the tally for one student remained at 0 with a consistency that had long since stopped being unremarkable. He thought, once or twice, about saying something to someone. He concluded, after consideration, that there was nothing to say. A student who was coping was not a formal report. That was a description of things being fine. He had Hermes. That was the other thought that occurred to him. The screech owl had been given to him by his parents when he made prefect, small and grave-faced and reliable, and Percy wrote home every Sunday because Sunday was the correct frequency. He reported on his studies and the general condition of the common room and occasionally on Ron's observable well-being, and his mother wrote back with questions about sleep and whether his prefect badge was staying polished, and Percy answered these questions with varying degrees of accuracy. He sat at his desk on a Saturday night in October and opened his parchment and wrote what needed writing. He was performing well in all subjects. The common room was orderly. He had also observed a Muggle-born student in the first year named Granger who was performing at an impressive level, which he thought his mother might find interesting. He stopped and looked at what he'd written. He picked up his quill. He wanted to mention, he wrote, in the interest of complete reporting, which was always his interest, that there was a student in the Gryffindor first year who had not received any post since term began. The family was not a writing family. There was no one sending him anything. He was not visibly affected and was coping entirely well, and Percy would not have raised it except that he found he was unable not to raise it, which was not a sentence a prefect put in a letter, but the underlying fact was this: he had been watching 6 weeks of breakfasts, and the tally for this student remained at 0, and Percy had come to think of him privately as the boy who never got post. He did not want to make too much of it. He only wanted his mother to know. He signed his name and year, folded the letter, and told himself he would send it in the morning. He put on his dressing gown and went to the owlery at 10:30. Hermes was awake on his perch with his usual expression of measured neutrality. Percy attached the letter with more care than the letter's weight warranted, checked the knot, and then opened the owlery window. The October night came in cold and complete. Below the castle, the grounds lay dark, the lake a flat darkness, the edge of the forbidden forest a ragged line against a sky thick with stars. Hermes looked out at all of it, and then he looked back at Percy once, and then he dropped from the sill and was climbing before Percy had registered the motion. A pale shape rising on the cold air, already small, angling south and west toward Devon. Percy watched until there was nothing left to watch. He closed the window and pinned his prefect badge back onto his dressing gown and walked through the dark corridor toward Gryffindor Tower. He had done what needed doing: a letter, a name, an observation passed along. Whatever came of it was his mother's business now. He had fulfilled his role, which was to notice and report, and he had noticed and he had reported, and the matter was concluded. He did not think about it for the rest of the night. This was not true. Hermes arrived on a Tuesday, which was unusual. Percy wrote home on Sundays. Molly had the kettle on, and Ginny half-fed at the kitchen table, and a wool sleeve for Ron that she'd been meaning to finish since September. And then the screech owl landed on the windowsill with Percy's handwriting on the outside, and she understood, before she broke the seal, that this was not a Sunday letter. Percy's Sunday letters were a particular length. This one was shorter, which meant it was specific, which meant something had prompted it. She wiped her hands on her apron and read it at the table, while Ginny watched her with the bright, patient attention of someone who had learned that watching was the fastest way to find out things. Percy had written, in his most correct hand, that there was a student in the Gryffindor first year he wanted to mention, not formally, in the interest of complete information. The student had not received any post since term began. The family was Muggle, non-corresponding. There was no one writing to him, and Percy had noted this across 6 weeks of Morning Post and had taken to thinking of this student, privately, as the boy who never got post. He did not want to make too much of it. He thought Mum should know. Molly set the letter down and looked at it for a moment. She knew who it was. She'd have known without Percy telling her. She'd have known from the phrase alone, from the particular way her oldest son, who was not Bill, had dressed up a feeling in the language of a duty report. She knew because she had met the boy in question on the 1st of September at King's Cross, when he'd been standing in the middle of the station, not knowing which platform to look for, managing his cart alone with the quiet competence of someone who had learned not to ask for help. She'd helped him find the barrier, and he'd thanked her, formal and a little startled by it, and she'd learned his name, and she'd thought, with a clarity she would not have been able to explain to Arthur or to anyone. Poor dear. No wonder he was alone, small and thin. Untidy black hair, round glasses on a face that was all sharp edges beneath the soft of still being 11. The lightning bolt scar at his fringe, visible for a moment when the wind came through the station. She had thought about him, on and off, since September, not with any plan, just the thought, recurring. Poor dear. "Who's it from?" Ginny said. "Percy. Is he all right?" "He's perfectly fine. He's written about one of the first years." Ginny's expression did the thing it did when she decided information might be relevant, a sharpening, an elevation of attention that started in her eyes. "Which one?" Molly looked at her youngest. Ginny was 10 years old and had been hearing the name Harry Potter since before she was old enough to understand what it meant, and it had accrued in her imagination over the years the way names did when children had nothing concrete to attach them to. It had grown larger than a person, mythic, belonging to a story about the night everything changed. "Harry Potter," Molly said. Ginny went very still in the way she went still when something was simultaneously exactly what she'd expected and more than she'd known how to expect. "What about him?" "He doesn't get any post. Not once since September. Percy's been watching." Molly folded the letter and set it flat. "He grew up Muggle. There's no one writing to him." "No one?" "Not one owl." Ginny was quiet for a moment, then, "That's not right." "No," Molly agreed. "It isn't." The kitchen held the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in October. The kettle, the wind outside, the creak of the house settling. The garden beyond the window was bare and brown, the gnome population having retreated to wherever gnomes went when the cold came. Molly sat with the folded letter and thought about her brothers. She did not go toward that grief often. She had learned in the years since the war ended to manage the distance carefully. You did not look at it directly. You kept it in the periphery. You let it be there without letting it be the thing you were always looking at. But sometimes something brought her around a corner before she'd meant to turn it. And there they were. Two men who had laughed at the same things she laughed at, who had grown up under the same roof, who had gone to fight in a war that none of them had chosen and who had not come back from it. 5 Death Eaters, she'd been told afterward. 5 for 2. She had been several months pregnant with Ron when it happened. She had known since the night the war ended and the news came what the war had produced as well as what it had consumed. The war had taken people who loved each other and left children who had survived without anyone to love them. James and Lily Potter, murdered in their home. Their son in the rubble of the house with a scar on his forehead and no one left to explain any of it to him. He'd been 11 months old. He was 11 years old now. 10 years of everyone knowing his name and no one particularly knowing him, and Percy, who put everything in a prefect report, had noticed and written home because somewhere underneath the pomposity Percy was still a Weasley, and Weasleys noticed when someone wasn't getting enough of something. Molly got up from the table and opened the cupboard where she kept the wool. She had emerald green that she'd bought in August for no clear reason because the color pleased her. She took it down and turned the ball in her hands. "Mum," Ginny said. She had the tone she used when she'd already worked out what was happening but wanted to hear it confirmed. "I'm going to knit him a jumper." Molly sat back down with the wool and her needles, old ones, wooden, worn smooth over many years. "A Christmas jumper, with an H." Ginny stared. "You're going to send Harry Potter a Weasley jumper." "I'm going to send a boy a jumper. He doesn't have to be Harry Potter to need a jumper." She began casting on. The motions were as familiar as breathing. The cast on, the first row, the needles finding their rhythm before she'd consciously thought about it. "He just happens to also be Harry Potter." Ginny was quiet for a moment, processing this in the way she processed things that did not fit neatly into existing categories. The hero worship was still in her face. It did not go away. It was too settled in. But sitting beside it now was something more uncertain, a slight adjustment of scale. The boy who never got post did not fit precisely into the story she had been told. Arthur came home at 7:30, smelling of flu powder and a long day at the ministry, and Molly told him over dinner. His face did exactly what she expected. "A Muggle-raised wizard," Arthur said. "He grew up knowing nothing about any of it, and then—" He stopped himself because Molly was looking at him. "Not one letter, since September? Not one?" And Percy noticed. Arthur said this with the fond, slightly surprised tone he reserved for Percy's better qualities. "Good lad. I've started the jumper." Arthur looked at the emerald knitting on the table beside Molly's plate and nodded with an expression of simple approval. They talked about the end of the war, the way they sometimes did when something brought it near the surface, where each of them had been, what they'd heard, the strange grief and relief of that night, the people they had lost who didn't see it end. Molly talked about her brothers without particularly meaning to, and Arthur listened the way he always listened, without trying to fix it. And when she stopped, he put his hand over hers for a moment on the table, and then they were done with it, and they cleared the dishes. Later, after Ginny was in bed, and Arthur had fallen asleep in the armchair, Molly sat at the kitchen table alone with the emerald wool and the clicking needles. The H was taking shape in the green, small yet not legible, just a pattern emerging from the work. The burrow was quiet around her in the particular way of a house that was rarely this quiet, and the fire had burned down to a comfortable warmth. She thought about what Percy had written, the boy who never got post. She thought about a platform at King's Cross, and a small boy in 2 large clothes, not looking up at the owls because looking up had never given him a reason to. She could not fix most of what needed fixing. She could not return his parents, or his 10 years, or explain to the world that the lightning bolt scar was not the same thing as a family. She could send him a thick, hand-knitted sweater in emerald green with an H on the front, and a large box of homemade fudge, and make sure that on Christmas morning, there was 1 pile of post that had his name on it. The needles kept their rhythm. The H grew in the green. Outside, the Devon countryside was dark and cold and very quiet, and inside the burrow the fire ticked and the wool moved through her fingers, stitch by stitch by stitch. The owls came at breakfast, and Harry watched them without watching them. He had developed this skill early at the Dursleys, and had arrived at Hogwarts not knowing it was a skill. Not knowing that most people didn't have a practiced method for observing a room from the corner of their attention while appearing entirely focused on something else. He'd thought it was just how he was. It turned out it was also useful here, where being caught staring at other people's post would be a difficult thing to explain, because the only honest explanation was that he'd never received any and had apparently developed an involuntary interest in watching people who had. The Great Hall at breakfast was very good for this kind of sideways attention. It was large enough that his vantage point at the Gryffindor table gave him sight lines across the whole room, and the post arrived with enough commotion, 200 owls in through the high windows in the rush of a minute, letters dropping from talons, the occasional package landing somewhere it hadn't been aimed, to make watching it feel like watching weather rather than watching people. He could observe without being seen to observe. He was good at it. Percy Weasley sorted his post at the far end of the table, as though each envelope were official correspondence requiring personal examination before filing. Fred and George, across from each other, passed something between them with identical expressions that suggested it had not come from their mother. Ron, sitting next to Harry, opened a letter in the straightforward way of someone who had been receiving letters for as long as he could remember and had never had cause to find this remarkable. He read it, folded it back up, tucked it away, and went back to his bacon without ceremony. This was the most interesting thing about watching Ron open his mother's letters, the absence of ceremony. The letters were expected, so they required no performance of gratitude. Harry looked at his plate. He had Hedwig. She was the best thing he owned, which was not a high bar given the state of his trunk's contents before September, but which would have been true regardless. Hagrid had given her to him in Diagon Alley in August, and she had regarded him then from inside her cage with a calm assessment that he'd found inexplicably comforting. A snowy owl with amber eyes that did not blink at inconvenient times. She was beautiful and extremely capable, and currently sitting in the owlery, with absolutely no one to carry letters for. He went to visit her when he could find a reason to be near the owlery, which was most evenings when the weather wasn't too bad. He sat on the high railing beside her, and she shifted her weight from foot to foot, and occasionally allowed him to stroke her feathers, which she seemed to find acceptable rather than enjoyable, in the manner of someone accepting an apology they'd already determined was sincere. He'd thought about writing to Hagrid. Hagrid had given him Hedwig, which meant he was the sort of person who wrote things and expected responses, and Harry could write to him. He just kept not doing it. The thought of writing, "Things are fine, I have a friend," felt both completely true and somehow not enough, like handing someone a summary of a book instead of the book. He meant to write it. He kept not writing it. October. The leaves came down on the grounds in drifts, amber and brown, and the particular red that Harry had never seen enough of before, living somewhere with trees, and the mornings in the great hall grew cold and bright. The owls kept arriving. Nothing came for Harry, which he had mostly stopped filing under the heading of surprising. The Dursleys did not write. he had not expected them to. There had been a small, unreasonable part of him, arriving at Hogwarts in September with everything he owned in a single trunk, that had wondered whether being somewhere extraordinary would change the arithmetic. Whether the kind of place that had magic would also produce as a natural byproduct the kind of circumstances in which Harry Potter received post. It had not. That was fine. Ron's letters from home came 2 or 3 times a week on thick cream parchment. Sometimes there was fudge in the package that accompanied them, which Ron shared without making a thing of it, which Harry appreciated more than he was going to say. The letters were from Ron's mother, mostly, though occasionally from his father, who wrote in a quick, energetic hand about ministry business that he seemed to find genuinely thrilling. Harry learned to recognize the different hands without meaning to. He would have said he wasn't reading over Ron's shoulder. He wasn't reading over Ron's shoulder. He was simply aware, in the peripheral, involuntary way he was aware of most things in any given room, that the letters existed and arrived and were opened. The carefully neutral non-reaction became something he didn't have to think about. That was how he knew he was getting good at it. Then there was Halloween. The troll was enormous and entirely real, and Harry had not made a rational decision going into the girls' bathroom. He had made a fast one, which was a different thing, and which had ended with Hermione Granger standing alive and uninjured in the wreckage, covered in dust, looking at Harry with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Something that was not her usual mild exasperation with him. Something that was, he thought, closer to recognition. She told the teachers a version of events that protected all 3 of them, and the friendship that had been theoretical since September became actual on the walk back up from the dungeons, in the unsaid way that some things became real between people without anyone agreeing to make them real. He had people now, 2 of them. He still had no post. Late November brought the Nimbus 2000, and the news that he was the youngest Seeker in a century. He had not previously known that flying was something he was going to be good at. He'd been on a broom exactly once before the morning McGonagall summoned him out of charms and told him, with the compressed satisfaction of someone delivering news they approved of, that he'd been selected for the house team. He'd stood there trying to look less stunned than he felt, because stunned seemed like the wrong register for good news, though nobody had told him what the right register was. The Nimbus 2000 was the finest object Harry had ever held, which, again, not a high bar, but which would have been true for anyone who'd ever held a Nimbus 2000 and actually understood what they were holding. The moment he got it off the ground at the first practice session and felt the cold air come up under him as the castle fell away below, something happened in his body that he recognized immediately and could not have anticipated, the sensation of being in precisely the right place. Not the right place for the team or the right place for Gryffindor or the right place for anyone else's purposes, just the right place. His. For a thing he was actually good at, for the first time, with no one's hand-me-down history attached to it. He thought about this on the way up to the dormitory that night, and then stopped thinking about it because thinking too long about things that felt good had never been a productive exercise. By December, the rhythm of the term had established itself well enough that Harry mostly stopped actively marking his empty spot at breakfast. He had the Quidditch pitch at dawn when the air was so cold it made his eyes water. He had Ron's completely unsentimental companionship and Hermione's detailed objections to whatever they were doing in every lesson, and Fred and George's commitment to treating him like a reasonably interesting person rather than a symbol, and the particular ease of Percy's formal stiff acknowledgments in the common room, which at least were consistent. He had enough. He still had nothing on the table. Hedwig waited in the owlery with her amber eyes and her patience, watching the door for him when he came. He stroked her feathers and felt vaguely sorry for both of them, and then put that away, because vague sorry was not useful and did not improve anyone's situation. He did not know, sitting at breakfast in the first week of December, watching the owls perform their efficient daily miracle, that somewhere in Devon a pair of wooden needles was working an H in emerald green into something thick and hand-knitted and already addressed to him. He did not know it was coming. He had nothing to compare it to that would have let him know to expect it. He just sat at the table with his hands empty, and the owls came and went, and the great hall was full of its ordinary daily noise, and he watched from the side the way he watched everything, and he did not know yet what it felt like to have something arrive. The castle was different when it was nearly empty. Harry had not expected this. He'd expected quiet. He knew quiet, had lived inside it for years, had learned to read the particular pressure of a house that wanted you to be smaller and less present than you were. That was the Privet Drive quiet. This was not that. This was a building that did not require anything from him. The tapestries still moved at the edges of his vision in the draft from the high windows. The fires still burned in the grates. The staircases still shifted on their own schedules, which he could hear sometimes at night, the distant groaning of stone repositioning itself for reasons a staircase had never felt obligated to explain. The castle went about its business without him, and this turned out to be the opposite of threatening. He was here, and it did not mind him, and that was a complete description of the situation. Ron had not gone home either, which Harry had not anticipated, and was relieved by in a way he didn't examine too closely. A handful of others stayed. A Hufflepuff third year, a Ravenclaw girl he didn't know, but they kept mostly to their own common rooms, and the days between arriving at Christmas break and Christmas morning had a stretched, unhurried quality that Harry didn't have a word for because he'd never experienced it before. He read. He played chess badly against Ron. He ate meals in the small, warm side room they used during holiday, the table scaled down and candlelit and somehow more itself for being only for a few people. He did not count down the days because there was no reason to count them. He slept without bracing for anything. Christmas morning arrived as a fact. He became aware of it the way you become aware of good weather, not as a surprise, exactly, but as something that required reorienting to, because it was better than the null expectation. He lay in his bed in the empty dormitory and registered that it was cold and bright and that there were shapes at the foot of his bed that had not been there the night before. He regarded them for a moment from a distance. He was aware, at a practical level, that things were different now, that this was Hogwarts and not Privet Drive, and that presents were within the realm of what happened here. He still felt the animal caution of someone approaching a thing that looked good, because looking good had historically not been sufficient. He sat up. He pulled the nearest parcel toward him. There were several. More than he'd expected, there was a Weasley family sort of abundance to the pile. And since he knew Ron's family sent things to Ron every year and could apparently not send a single parcel without sending 12, this was not entirely surprising. He went through them with a careful attention that was perhaps slightly too attentive for someone who had not been waiting for anything. A silvery, folded something in wrapping paper with no note. He set this aside. He would come back to it. He was not ready to come back to it yet because the folded silver thing defied classification. Then there was another parcel, wrapped in brown paper, which he turned over and felt before opening. It was large and yielding and faintly warm, the way things are warm when they have been with something else for a long time. A handwritten tag. He read it. For Harry. Happy Christmas. Mrs. Weasley. He read it again. He opened the parcel slowly, which was not how he usually did things. He was not a slow, careful opener. He'd never had enough to unwrap to develop a preference. But he opened this one slowly because there was something in the weight of it that asked to be done carefully. The brown paper fell away, a sweater. Hand-knitted, emerald green, thick in the way of something made to actually be warm rather than to approximate warmth. He spread it out flat on the bed and looked at it. The H on the front, his initial, worked in the green, present in the slightly raised texture of a different stitch, sat in the center of the chest. He ran his thumb across it. Someone had made this. Not found it, not bought it at reduced price from a bargain bin, not handed it along from someone who'd grown out of it. Made it. The H was not a coincidence of the pattern. It was specific and deliberate, put there for him, proof that whoever had made it had been thinking about him the whole time. He sat with it in his lap for a long moment and did not do anything. Then he put it on. It fit. He pushed his arms through the sleeves and pulled it down over his head, and the wool settled against him exactly where it was supposed to settle, and the hem sat at exactly the right place, and the shoulders were precisely where his shoulders were, and he understood in a way he couldn't have understood before that this had simply never happened to him. He had worn Dudley's old things his whole life. Dudley's old trousers, Dudley's old shirts, all of it meant for someone several sizes larger in every direction, all of it hanging or bunching or trailing. He had not had a word for why that mattered. He had a word for it now because the sweater fit, and therefore the word was obvious. Everything else had been a demonstration that he was approximate. Someone else's leftover size, someone else's discarded shape, fitted to nothing because fitting to nothing was the point. The sweater fit because it had been made to fit him. He was the exact size it was designed for because he was the size someone had paid attention to. He sat very still in the empty dormitory with the emerald green wool warm against his chest, and did not look at anything in particular for a while. There was also, he remembered, a large box of homemade fudge. He had a piece. It was very good. He had a second piece and decided he was capable of joining the rest of the day. Ron was already downstairs in a maroon sweater that fit him in the technical sense of covering him adequately, which he was wearing with the expression of someone serving out a sentence. "Maroon," Ron said when Harry came in. The word contained an entire editorial position. "It's not bad," Harry said. "It's maroon. She knows I hate maroon." Ron looked at Harry's sweater without judgment and said, "Yours is nice," and meant it, and said nothing else about it, which was the right thing to do. Fred and George arrived not long after from wherever they'd been, wearing matching blue jumpers with F and G worked on them in yellow, which they'd arranged on their persons with ironic precision. Percy came in with his under his arm and a very clear intention of not wearing it, which Fred and George resolved within approximately 45 seconds by the simple method of pulling it over his head from behind while he was mid-sentence about something else. The P faced outward. Percy arranged his dignity, which took a moment, and then accepted the situation with the compressed practicality of someone who knew a lost cause. Harry watched this. The ease of it, the way no one explained what it meant or why it mattered, because it was obvious what it meant and why it mattered. There was a language inside it that he was watching from the outside, except that he was not entirely on the outside this year because he was wearing the green sweater, and Molly Weasley had sent it with the same expectation she sent all the others, and he was, for the first time in his life, inside the tradition at the same time as everyone else. He turned this fact over privately while Fred and George performed a cheerful reconstruction of the Percy event for each other with embellishments. She had met him for 5 minutes on a train platform in September. She had helped him through a barrier and learned his name. That was the full inventory of what she'd known about him when she sat down and made this, when she chose the color, when she cast on the stitches, when she worked the H into the front of it for the specific purpose of there being an H in the front of it for him. She had known almost nothing about him, and she had done it anyway, and he did not know how to receive something given before it was earned, because nothing had ever been given before it was earned, and the assumption had hardened into a structural fact that he had not known was false until this morning. He had a third piece of fudge. He spent the rest of the day with the Weasleys, all of them, in the casual sprawl of a holiday without much structure, and the fire was warm, and the jumpers were worn, and no one needed to be formal about anything. He did not take the sweater off when he went to bed. He had not planned to keep it on. It was not a considered decision. But when he lay down in the dormitory and pulled the blankets up, he was still wearing it, and it was warm, and he was very tired, and it did not seem necessary to take it off. He would not mention this to anyone. He slept without bracing for anything, which was twice in the same week, and he was asleep before he finished being surprised by it. The parchment sat on the desk in the corner of the common room, and Harry sat in the chair opposite it, and neither of them did anything. This was the third evening in a row. He knew he should write a thank you letter. This was not the difficult part. The difficult part was harder to name than should, and he had spent 3 evenings failing to name it while also failing to write anything. The parchment remained blank and accusatory and very white in the firelight, and Harry remained in the chair with his quill in his hand and the sweater on, because he had been wearing the sweater most evenings since Christmas, in a way he was not making an announcement about. He had received letters before. The Hogwarts letters, in the summer, dozens of them, and then hundreds, coming through every gap the Dursleys tried to seal. Those had been official. An institution communicating a fact about him to him, which he'd been entitled to by the mechanics of what he was. They had not required a response. They had not, exactly, chosen him. They had identified him and notified him, and that was the full extent of the relationship. He had never written a personal letter to someone who chose to write to him first. He understood that this was a strange thing to have never done. It was the sort of thing that probably seemed obvious from the outside. You said thank you. And that was the end of it, and the thank you could be brief, and there was no particular skill involved. He was aware that this was what it looked like from the outside. Ron had explained this to him on the second evening, sitting across the common room with a chessboard between them, watching Harry stare at the blank parchment. "Just write the letter, Harry. She's not the Minister for Magic." "I know," Harry said. "Then what's the problem?" Harry looked at the parchment. "I don't know what to say. Thank you for the jumper. It's nice. Happy New Year. Done. 4 seconds. "Right," Harry said. He picked up his quill. He did not write anything. After a moment, he set the quill down. Ron made the sound of someone deciding not to say the obvious thing, which was one of Ron's better qualities, and went back to repositioning his castle with unnecessary precision. The problem was not what to say. Harry knew what to say. The problem was that he had never been required to speak to someone who wanted to hear from him. Every interaction he could recall that involved him saying something to an adult had operated from the same basic structure. He was required to be there, or required to answer, or required to behave a certain way. And the speech was a response to a demand, and the demand was the whole basis of the relationship. Mrs. Weasley had given him a sweater with his initial on it because she had wanted to. She had written a name on a parcel and sent it because she had chosen to, without being required, without being his family by blood or by obligation. She was not required to hear from him. She had apparently wanted to, and he did not know what you said to that. He did not know what register that required. He did not know how to speak into that space without sounding either too small or like he was making too much of something ordinary. On the fourth evening, he picked up the quill and wrote. He wrote slowly, watching each word like someone who might need to take it back. He said, "Thank you." He said the sweater was very warm and that it fit, and that he appreciated it more than he was going to go into detail about. Because going into detail was the problem, and he had found a way around going into detail by simply saying he appreciated it without the detail. He said he hoped she'd had a good Christmas. He wrote his owl's name, Hedwig, because that seemed like a thing you included when you were sending a letter by owl, and because Hedwig had been waiting in the owlery for 4 months for someone to give her a reason to go somewhere, and it had seemed only right to mention her by name. He signed it Harry. He read what he'd written. It was very short. Short enough that the space at the bottom of the parchment made clear without anyone having to say so that there had been longer versions of this letter that had not made it. He folded it before he could revise it a 5th time. He went up to the dormitory and got his coat, and he walked through the castle to the owlery with the cold coming up through the stone floors and the torches casting their orange light on the tapestries. And Hedwig looked at him from her perch with her amber eyes and her very particular expression of someone who has been patient for an exceptionally long time and is prepared to be patient a while longer. He attached the letter. He thought about saying something to her, which was the sort of thing he would not be doing, obviously, but he did smooth her wing once before he let her go. She regarded this as acceptable. She dropped from the sill into the dark and rose without effort, circling once above the owlery roof and then straightening west, already very small, already part of the dark. He watched until there was nothing left to watch. The burrow was in the middle of its normal Tuesday morning when Hedwig arrived, which meant there were dishes in the sink and the radio going in the corner and the smell of something in the oven that would not be ready for several hours and was already filling the kitchen with the particular smell of a house that cooked in quantity. Molly recognized Harry's owl from Christmas. She had been to the owlery once at Hogwarts years ago, and the amber eyes were distinctive, and felt something quiet shift in her chest as she untied the letter. She read it at the kitchen table. She read it twice. It was very short, and it was careful, and it was exactly the kind of letter written by someone who had never done this before and was not sure it was going to land right. The words arranged with too much precision, the gratitude present in the space around them, rather than said directly. The way it ended, just before it might have said something more. She had raised 6 sons. She knew the letter that came when someone had written and thrown away and written and thrown away and finally sent the shortest possible version before they lost their nerve. He'd mentioned his owl. She sat at the table for a moment longer, holding the letter, and then she got up and found her parchment. She wrote the same afternoon. She wrote the way she always wrote, which was with no awareness of being too much, because she had raised 6 children and was expecting a 7th and had never in her life been accused of insufficient warmth by any person who mattered. She told him she was glad the sweater fit. She told him she'd thought the green would suit him. She told him that Hedwig sounded lovely and that snowy owls were very reliable in the cold, and that she hoped he was eating properly because she'd been hearing things from Ron about the school meals, and while she had no official opinion on Hogwarts food, she had an unofficial one, and growing boys required more than an official opinion could convey. She mentioned that the burrow was cold and that Arthur had spent the weekend in a very enthusiastic disagreement with a muggle snowblower someone had left on the edge of their property, the details of which were not entirely resolved. She signed it Molly Weasley, and then she looked at the name and added, below it, in smaller letters, _ Mrs. Weasley if you prefer, but Molly is fine. She folded it and she gave it to the Weasley's family owl, and she went back to her oven and she thought, "Good. Good then." Molly's reply came the following Friday. Harry was at breakfast when it arrived. Not the family owl he'd come to recognize from Ron's post, but the same general direction, the same Devon handwriting on the outside. And he opened it at the table and read it once, and then folded it and thought for a moment, and unfolded it and read it again. She had written back the same afternoon, she said near the end. He had not known this until he read it. He read the letter a third time, more slowly, trying to determine if it was real. It appeared to be real. The ink was real. The handwriting was real. The news about Arthur and the snowblower was oddly specific in the way of things that were true rather than invented, and the note about Hedwig was accurate, because snowy owls were indeed reliable in the cold, and he had not made up the letter in any way he could identify. He put it in the front pocket of the sweater because that was where it seemed to go. He sat for a moment longer at the Gryffindor table while the post arrived around him, and the great hall went about its ordinary morning, and he was wearing an emerald green jumper and had a letter in the pocket of it that had been written the same afternoon his had arrived, and the owls came and went through the high windows in their usual rush, and something about the morning was different, though he would not have been able to say precisely what if anyone had thought to ask. By February, Harry Potter was receiving post, Percy noticed. Of course, Percy noticed. Noticing was the foundational competency of his entire approach to being at Hogwarts, and he was not going to pretend otherwise to himself, even if he would have pretended otherwise to anyone who asked. He had noticed the absence for 6 weeks in the autumn, and he had done something about the absence. And now there were envelopes arriving at the first-year table at irregular intervals and being opened with the particular focus of someone who still considered each one individually, not the reflexive ease of a person long accustomed to post, but something more deliberate. Something that still meant something. Percy filed this under a heading he had not named. He had not named the heading because naming the heading would have required a degree of sentimentality that Percy was not prepared to acknowledge before breakfast. He watched from his position at the far end of the table, near enough to the prefect's distance from the younger students, and he ate his porridge, and he catalogued, and on the mornings when a letter arrived at Harry's place he noted it and returned to his own correspondence with the brisk competence of a person for whom correspondence was an entirely routine affair. He told himself this was sufficient. It was not February, however, but rather a Thursday in March when the howler arrived. Percy heard it coming before it landed. There was always a slight brightening of the envelope's red that preceded detonation, which Percy had observed across several years of living with Fred and George, and he had time to straighten his back and arrange his expression before the thing hit the table in front of Ron and exploded at full volume. Their mother's voice filled the great hall. It bounced from the stone ceiling and rang off the house tables and delivered its message, regarding Ron's failure to write home in 11 days, regarding the state of Ron's school robes as reported by Ron himself in his most recent letter, and regarding several peripheral concerns that were entirely justified, at the volume of someone who had no interest in the question of indoor versus outdoor tone. The entire Gryffindor table flinched at the opening note, as they always did, and the Ravenclaw table looked up with the resigned interest of people for whom this was not the first time. Percy did not flinch. He had grown up with the howler voice. He did glance, from his position at the far end of the table, at Harry Potter. Harry was watching the howler with an expression Percy could not entirely pass. Not the terror of someone unacquainted with the format, not the resignation of someone who had received one, something closer to a flicker, very quick, like a person who'd caught a joke they hadn't expected to find funny, mixed with something else that was harder to name, something that was watching his mother's enormous voice fill the hall with the focused attention of someone who had never heard anything quite like it before and was filing it somewhere important. Ron's expression throughout was the expression of a person suffering a publicly administered sentence with the dignity of someone who'd known what they'd signed up for when they failed to write for 11 days. The howler burnt itself out. The hall resumed. Percy went back to his toast. Elsewhere in the castle that spring, in a room at the top of a winding staircase that most students never had occasion to visit, an old man sat behind a desk covered in curious silver instruments that turned and ticked with their own quiet purposes. He had half-moon spectacles and a very long silver beard that pooled onto the desk's edge when he leaned forward, and a crooked nose, and he was reading a letter. He already knew its contents. He knew most things that entered and left this school, in the way of headmasters who had been at the business long enough to have built, between themselves and the castle, an understanding that was less like observation and more like peripheral awareness. He had known about the first letter, Weasley's neat handwriting, the quiet concern of a prefect who had noticed something. He had known when the first reply arrived. He had known about the Christmas parcel and the thank you letter, and the subsequent exchange that had now established itself into a reliable pattern of 2 or 3 letters a month. He had not interfered. He had made choices, in October of 1981, that he had made carefully and had not made lightly. He had placed a boy with his only remaining blood family, and he had chosen not to explain the details of that arrangement to the wider world, and those choices had produced a 10-year quiet that had served a necessary purpose. The quiet had also produced other things. He was not unaware of what the other things were. He had watched the boy arrive at this school in September and had seen, in the face of an 11-year-old navigating his first weeks among people who were glad to see him, a wariness that was the particular kind learned in the absence of gladness. He folded the letter. He set it on the desk. He watched one of his silver instruments turn a small spiral shape and release a thin curl of smoke, and he thought about a boy in a dormitory who now opened his post without setting it aside. He put his spectacles back on. He did not move to stop what was moving. April, May, the spring term moved with the accelerating quality of terms that had a great deal happening in them, and Percy managed his rounds and his prefect correspondence and his OWL revision. And the defense professor's activities became, toward the end of term, an open source of speculation among students who had noticed that something was slightly wrong with the third-floor corridor and that the professor in question winced in a particular way during Quidditch matches. Percy noted this and did not speculate in the open because Percy did not speculate in the open about professors, and he had his OWLs to think about. It was in the common room on a Tuesday evening in May during his prefect's rounds. Not eavesdropping, Percy did not eavesdrop. He was performing his rounds in the legitimate and documented manner of someone doing his job, that he heard Harry Potter say, very quietly, "No one has ever asked before." Percy stopped. He had come around the back of the armchairs by the fire, where Harry and Ron were sitting with a chessboard between them and an open letter on the cushion beside Harry. He had not meant to hear. He had simply been there, and it had been said, and it was not the kind of sentence you could unhear. Ron went still. Percy, behind the armchair, also went still. Then Ron said, with the slightly too loud energy of someone changing the subject on behalf of another person who had not asked to have it changed, "Right. Well, chess, your move." Percy completed his rounds. He went back to his dormitory and sat on his bed and did not immediately pick up his OWL revision notes, which he would normally have done because he was supposed to get through the next 2 chapters by Thursday. He sat. He thought about October, about a Saturday night, about the specific composition of a letter that had begun as a duty report and had ended in something that did not belong to the duty report category. He thought about what the letter had said, which was, "I wanted my mother to know." He thought about what it had meant, which was something he had not allowed himself to think about in direct terms before, because direct terms required sentimentality, and Percy was not sentimental. He sat with the knowledge that he had done something right. Not correct, right? The distinction mattered, though he could not immediately write it out as an equation, which was the form in which Percy preferred distinctions to arrive. He had written a letter because he had seen something and had been unable to not act on it, and the letter had produced a chain that had led to a boy in an armchair in May saying no one has ever asked before in the tone of someone saying a fact out loud for the first time, a fact they had known for a long time, a fact that had perhaps weighed something. Percy would not tell anyone this. It was not the sort of thing you announced. He picked up his OWL revision notes. He got through both chapters before lights out. He did not think about the armchair, and he did not think about October, and he was, as a matter of fact, not nearly as unsentimental as he required himself to be. The spring term wound on, and the end of it came with the particular energy of a year that had contained a great deal more than most. And at breakfast in June, Harry Potter opened the latest letter from Molly Weasley with the same absent efficiency with which Ron opened his, not the deliberate attention of someone for whom each letter still meant something individually, but the settled ease of someone who expected to have post. Percy noticed this too, and said nothing, and ate his breakfast. He filed it under no heading at all. The train moved south, and Harry kept his hand in his jacket pocket where Molly's last letter was, and watched the countryside happen beyond the window. She had asked at the end of it, in the postscript, in handwriting slightly different from the rest of the letter, as if she'd added it after folding it and then unfolded it again, whether he'd write over the summer. He'd written back, yes. He'd meant it. He still meant it, sitting on the Hogwarts Express with June light coming through the window and Hedwig asleep in her cage on the rack above him, her feathers the particular dense white of something genuinely at rest. He had people. He had Ron across from him, eating every last item in his share of the Honeyduke's sweets, and Hermione beside him with a book she was probably finishing for the second time, and a letter in his pocket from someone in Devon who had asked whether he'd write. He was, for the first time in his life, not dreading arriving at a destination. He was not specifically looking forward to arriving at this destination. That was different. The two conditions, not dreading and looking forward, were easy to confuse from the outside, but Harry had developed a fairly precise map of the territory between them, and he knew where he was on it. He was not nothing. He had people. He was returning to Privet Drive with things he hadn't had before, and he held on to this fact carefully, the way you held on to something in a high wind. Number 4. Privet Drive was, in the way of places that had never learned to accommodate you, exactly as he had left it. The same trimmed hedge, the same clean curtains, the same arrangement of house that said, through its architecture, that everything inside it was orderly, and had always been orderly, and would continue to be orderly, and that feelings of the inconvenient variety were not part of the arrangement. Aunt Petunia opened the door and looked at him with her long neck and her expression of someone who had been hoping, against the available evidence, that this particular summer might produce a different outcome. And Uncle Vernon behind her filled the doorframe in the way he always did. And Dudley looked at Harry's trunk and then looked away. Harry carried his things to his room. He unpacked nothing except Hedwig's cage. He left the trunk closed. He had been writing home, was the thing, all spring. He had written to someone who had wanted to hear from him, and she had written back in letters that were warm and full and slightly bossy about vegetables and occasionally contained news about the family that arrived in a cheerful, disorganized pile as though she had been saving it up and could now discharge it all at once. The burrow, from the letters, was loud and cramped and full of people who wanted things from each other constantly and apparently didn't consider this a problem worth solving. It was the opposite of Privet Drive in almost every measurable way. Harry had read those descriptions and felt something he couldn't name, which was probably longing, and had been careful not to name it. He gave himself the first week. Owls took time. The journey from Devon was not nothing, and Hedwig was not familiar with the route from this direction. He had written his letter on the third day of being back. Brief. He was home. He was fine. The usual. He hoped the garden gnomes were less aggressive this time of year, and sent it from his bedroom window in the early morning while the street was still quiet. He had watched Hedwig rise above the roofline and bank west and disappear. This was normal. Owls took time. He waited. The first week passed. Privet Drive went about its summer in the way of a place that had nothing happening in it and was pleased about this. Petunia's roses came in along the garden path. Vernon went to work and came back from work. Dudley watched television and ate crisps and occasionally looked at Harry as if Harry's continued existence in the house was a source of mild, ongoing inconvenience. Harry did his chores and said very little and waited. Hedwig came back in the second week without a reply. He sent another letter. He told himself this was fine. The first had probably crossed with whatever response was coming. It happened. It was not a sign of anything. He was not going to treat the absence of one reply as meaningful. He was 12 in July, and he was not going to assign significance to a postal delay as though correspondence operated on a perfect schedule. It did not. Owls were not infallible. There were any number of explanations. Hedwig returned again without a reply. Harry looked at the lack of letter in her talons and at Hedwig herself, who had the expression of an owl that had done her job correctly and was not responsible for what she'd found at the other end of it. And he put her back on her perch and gave her water and closed the cage door. He waited another week. Nothing came. Not from Devon. Not from Ron, who he'd also written to. A short note. Nothing. Just checking in. And not from Hermione, who he'd not written to but from whom he'd half expected something anyway, because Hermione was the sort of person whose correspondence schedule was probably color-coded. Not from any of them. His birthday was July 31st. He had known it was coming the way you know about appointments that you can't reschedule. It was a date. It arrived. The Dursleys had a dinner party that evening. Muggle guests, the good china, Petunia's voice at a different register than usual, the smells of a meal that was not for him. Harry sat in his room and listened to it happen below him. He had been thinking, over the previous weeks, that perhaps he had misunderstood the scale of something. Molly Weasley had been kind to a boy she'd helped through a barrier at King's Cross in September, and had knitted him a sweater, and had written him letters for 9 months, and these were real things that had happened. He was not disputing the reality. He was questioning the conclusion he had drawn from them, which was that the correspondence meant something durable, that it would survive geography, that he could take it out of Hogwarts and it would still exist. Perhaps, he thought, on the floor of his room with the dinner party noise filtering up through the floorboards, people were kind in specific contexts, and he had mistaken the context for a fact about himself. Hogwarts was a context. A boy with an empty mailbox at Hogwarts was a visible thing, a writable about thing, the kind of thing that produced a letter home from a concerned prefect. A boy in Surrey in the summer was just a boy in Surrey in the summer, which was not the same kind of thing. The kindness had been real. He was not saying it hadn't been real. He was saying that perhaps it had belonged to a set of circumstances that had now changed, and she was not obligated to extend it across all possible circumstances, and he had, as he sometimes did, wanted something to be permanent that had not been permanent, because wanting permanence was a reflex he had not successfully trained out of himself. He sat with this. It felt like being right about something you'd hoped to be wrong about. His birthday passed without post. This was, he told himself, fine. He got up from the floor and opened his trunk and looked at the sweater. He had meant to wear it around the house, in the evenings. It was July. Obviously, he hadn't worn it. But he'd intended to in the cooler months, or when he could, or eventually. It was still there, folded, the H still visible in the green. He had not been hiding it from the Dursleys specifically. He had just kept the trunk closed, and closing the trunk had happened to keep the sweater inside it. He looked at it for a moment. He put the lid of the trunk down, not putting the sweater away. There was a difference in how he understood it. He was not packing it back into something he was finished with. He was just closing the trunk. The sweater was still in there. The lid was down. The two things were true simultaneously and did not require him to decide anything. He went to bed. Below him, the dinner party said what dinner parties said. He lay in the dark and was quiet, in the way he was quiet when he was waiting for something he hadn't admitted he was still waiting for. She sent the first letter at the end of June, 3 days after term ended, because 3 days seemed like a reasonable interval for Harry to have arrived and settled, and she hadn't wanted to write before he'd even had time to unpack his trunk. She told him she hoped the journey home had been comfortable. She said the burrow was its usual summer self. The gnomes had returned to the garden with the particular persistence of creatures that did not take defeat personally, and Arthur had found a muggle appliance in the lane that he was working out the purpose of, and Fred and George were spending an alarming proportion of their free time in the garden shed with the door shut, which she had decided temporarily not to investigate. She asked how Harry was. She asked how the Dursleys were, which was the diplomatic version of what she actually wanted to ask, because what she actually wanted to ask was a question she did not have the right to ask of a boy she had been writing to for 9 months, which was, "Are they treating you properly?" She waited. Owls from Devon to Surrey and back took a few days usually. She gave it a week. Nothing came. She sent a second letter. She told herself this was not excessive. The first had perhaps been lost in transit, or Harry's owl was still finding the route from Surrey. She kept it shorter. She said she hoped things were going well and that she was looking forward to hearing from him. She gave it 2 weeks. July arrived with its particular thick heat, and the garden baked and the gnomes retreated to whatever they retreated to when it was too warm to gnome, and Molly sat at the kitchen table and wrote a third letter. She spent longer on this one. She was aware in the writing of it that she was trying to leave a door open, which required knowing which door had closed and why, and she didn't know either of these things. She mentioned the sweater, that she'd been thinking she might do him a thicker one for next winter, if he had a color preference, and had he had any preference about the style of the hem. This was an ordinary question. She was making it ordinary deliberately, which she was aware was a kind of hope dressed as housekeeping. No reply. His birthday was July 31st. She had sent a package, shortbread, which kept well in post, and a letter that she'd folded twice before sending because it had come out too long and too much, and she'd trimmed it, and it had still been a great deal more than she'd intended to write. She said happy birthday. She said she hoped it was a good one. She said Percy had mentioned that Harry seemed well at school and that she'd been very glad to hear it. She sat with the not hearing for 2 days before she asked Percy directly. He was in the garden, ostensibly reading, actually doing the slightly unfocused thing he did when he was thinking about more things than his face was showing. She put a glass of lemonade on the garden table and sat down. "Did Harry seem all right at school?" she asked. "In the spring. Was anything wrong?" Percy looked at his book. "He seemed fine," he said. "He was doing well. He had friends." A pause. His post was coming regularly by the end of term. "He's not writing back," Molly said. Percy was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was working something out but wasn't going to say what it was. "He might be having difficulty," he said eventually. "With the Dursleys. Getting access to his owl, or he said something in the spring once I heard it, he said..." He stopped. What did he say? He said no one had ever asked about his birthday before. Percy said it with the clipped efficiency of someone relaying a piece of information while also trying to keep the information at arm's length. "So it may be that the circumstances there are more constrained." Molly looked at her son. She had raised him. She knew exactly what Percy's face looked like when he was experiencing an emotion he had not yet agreed to be experiencing. "I see," she said. She took the lemonade back inside and didn't say anything else, because Percy was Percy, and the situation did not require her to name the feeling for him. That evening she told Arthur what Percy had said, and Arthur, with the practical reasonableness that was his most reliable quality, suggested gently that perhaps Harry had limited access to post at the Dursleys. That perhaps the Dursleys were making things difficult for him, which would not, Arthur chose his next words carefully, be entirely unlike what she already knew of them. "He was writing in the spring," Molly said. "All spring, every week or two, he was writing." "I know, love. He is not choosing not to write." "No," Arthur agreed. "I don't imagine he is." Molly said nothing else. Arthur said nothing else. The kitchen held its evening sounds, and the fading light came through the window over the garden, and she thought about a boy sitting in a house in Surrey that was, based on everything she could piece together from 9 months of careful reading between the lines of letters, not the kind of house a child had ever been glad to return to. There was a room in a house in Surrey, and in that room there were letters. They had been collected, one by one, across the summer, from a screech owl that arrived at the window, from a large brown owl, from a small barn owl that came on a Thursday in July with a very dense and carefully reasoned letter from someone who had clearly spent a great deal of time deciding exactly how to say what she wanted to say. Each letter had been taken before Harry could see it. Each outgoing letter, the ones Harry had written and left on his desk or handed to his owl, had been intercepted before the owl could carry them. The creature doing this was small, with large green eyes and ears like a bat's and a pillowcase worn like a garment, and it moved through the house with the nervous, determined purposefulness of someone who had decided what they were doing was right. The letters were not destroyed. This was very important. They were being kept. Kept carefully, in a stack, with the full intention of showing them to Harry eventually, when it was all over, when he understood, when he could see that people cared about him, and that was precisely why he couldn't go back. The creature had thought this through. The letters were proof. The letters were the point. The creature did not think about what the letters felt like to the people on the other side who had sent them and were waiting, and heard nothing back. Ginny was the one who said it out loud, which was a thing Ginny frequently was, because at 10 years old she had not yet acquired the habit of filtering her accurate observations through the question of whether they were comfortable. "Something's wrong with Harry Potter," she said one evening at dinner, which was the kind of sentence that silenced a table, because there were 6 people at this table, and most of them had complicated feelings about Harry Potter for different reasons, and Ginny's voice had none of their complications in it. "You've been writing him since June, Mum. He's not writing back." "I know," Molly said. "So something's wrong." "Ginny," Arthur said gently, "I'm just saying what we're all thinking." Ginny applied herself to her food with the serene confidence of someone who had made their point and was prepared to let the room catch up. She was not wrong. Molly had been thinking it since July, more specifically since Harry's birthday, when the family owl had returned with the birthday letter unopened, the seal still intact, the address in Molly's handwriting going nowhere. She had wanted, that evening, to go to Surrey, to get in Arthur's car and drive to Little Whinging and knock on the door of number 4 and see for herself. She had not, because Arthur had said, carefully and correctly, that they didn't know what Dumbledore's arrangements were, and that interfering with them without knowing the shape of them could cause more problems than it solved. He was right. She knew he was right. He had been right in the gentle, factual way that made her want to disagree with him purely on principle, which was not a reasonable basis for driving to Surrey. She sat at the kitchen table, late, after Arthur had gone up. The knitting needles were in her hands but not moving. The birthday letter was in front of her, returned, unopened. She didn't know whether something at the Surrey end had turned it around, or whether it was somewhere else entirely, somewhere she couldn't see or reach or fix. She set the letter down. She picked up the needles and started a new row of something she hadn't decided yet. Her hands needed to be doing something. They kept moving, even when she didn't know what she was making, because the motion was the point. The motion was the thing she had that she could do, and the click of the needles in the quiet kitchen was at least the sound of something continuing. She kept going until the kitchen was fully dark, and she was tired enough to stop. He heard them before he saw them. Voices outside his window. Low, familiar. The particular suppressed energy of people being quiet because they had decided to be quiet rather than because they were required to be. He was at the window before he'd finished waking up, and there was the car. It was turquoise and tilted at an angle and hovering several feet above the garden below his window, and there was Ron in the passenger seat leaning out with an expression of someone completing a mission, and there were the twins behind him, and the sight of all three of them outside his window at whatever hour of the night this was produced in Harry a feeling so abrupt and so complete that he didn't have a word for it. Someone had come. They had come for him. He hadn't known, until the moment he was standing at the window looking at them, that he'd needed that sentence to be true. "Took us a while to find the right house," Ron whispered, with the air of someone reporting back from a successful operation. "Getting out took longer than it should have. The bars on the window, which Uncle Vernon had installed sometime in the last few weeks, and which Harry had been looking at for days with the particular despair of someone who had not wanted to think too hard about what they meant, came off with a sound like something being corrected. Fred and George had a tool. Harry didn't ask where they'd got it. He handed down his trunk, his broomstick, Hedwig's cage, in a sequence of careful transfers above the sleeping street, and then he was in the car, and it was rising, and Privet Drive was below him getting smaller, and he did not look back at it. He looked forward instead, into the dark, at the particular black that existed above the ordinary dark of Surrey's night, and the car moved through it with the confidence of something that knew it was doing something it wasn't supposed to do, and had decided this was fine. The car was warm. The twins fell asleep within 20 minutes, which was the kind of thing only people with extremely clean consciences could do on a night flight in an illegal vehicle. Ron stayed awake with him, talking in the low-volume way of someone who respected the sleeping, until his head dipped twice, and he was also gone. Harry sat awake the whole way and watched England go by below him, and didn't feel like sleeping. The burrow appeared in the early grey light as a collection of shapes that should not have been able to support each other and appeared to have come to the same conclusion and kept going anyway. It listed to one side with the comfortable confidence of something that had done this for long enough to have stopped worrying about it. The windows were warm-colored, some of them, and there was smoke from the chimney, and the garden around it was a tangled, magnificent mess of things growing, and Harry, who had spent years looking at the Dursleys' trimmed hedges and sorted flower beds, felt something shift in him that he could not immediately classify. The car landed badly in the garden, which woke the twins, who were immediately cheerful about this. Ron climbed out with the specific energy of someone who was home and had complicated feelings about the number of things he was about to have to explain. Harry got out last. Molly was in the kitchen. She appeared in the doorway while they were still getting Harry's trunk out of the boot, and Harry saw her, and his body did what his body did around adult anger. He went still. He catalogued the expression, the set of the jaw, the particular brightness of the eyes, the way the hands were positioned. He had a decade of experience reading adult anger, and he was reading it now, his whole system reorganizing itself toward minimum footprint, toward quiet, toward finding the edge of the situation and staying close to it. "Fred and George Weasley," Molly said, in the voice she had when the volume wasn't the point, "and Ronald." And Harry did not move and waited. And then she looked at him. Her eyes went from her sons, who were, in fairness, the ones who had taken the car, to Harry, and something happened in her face. The anger did not leave. It was still there, still fully present. But it shifted. It moved. It stopped being directed outward and became something else, something that Harry had a harder time classifying because it was not a thing he had seen directed at him before. She looked at him the way she might have looked at someone who had been injured in a way she'd only just found out about. He was wearing Dudley's old things. He had been wearing them for 2 months. He was aware that they didn't fit. He had always been aware that they didn't fit. This had been the stable state of his clothing his entire life, and he had not thought about it differently since September, because you did not think about things that were simply true. He was aware of it now in the way you become aware of a temperature when someone else enters the room and reacts to it. "I didn't know," Molly said. 3 words, quietly. Harry didn't know what to say. He didn't say anything. He stood in the garden in the early morning with the car behind him and his trunk in the grass, and Molly Weasley looking at him the way no adult had ever looked at him, which was as though something that had happened to him mattered, and he did not have a word for what happened in him when she said it. "Come inside," she said, and her voice had gone different. "All of you. Come inside." The kitchen was warm and extremely full. Things came from everywhere, from the stove, from the counter, from a cupboard that seemed to have anticipated the morning, and arranged themselves into a breakfast that Harry, who had been eating Dursley portions all summer, regarded with the automatic wariness of someone who had learned not to expect abundance. He took what was put in front of him. He ate carefully, the old instinct. Don't take more than offered. Don't invite the commentary that came when you wanted too much. Molly put more on his plate. She did it without making a thing of it. With the same absent efficiency she applied to everything in the kitchen, the same motion she used for her own children. And Harry stopped. And then he ate that too. And then she put more. And he stopped calculating what he was permitted and ate, because it turned out that was what you did when someone kept putting things on your plate without suggesting it was remarkable that you were hungry. Molly watched him from the other side of the kitchen, not staring. He would have noticed staring. Watching, in the sideways way of someone who was attending to other things and also attending to this. Percy had written to her, in October, about a boy who never got post. She had read the letter at the kitchen table with Ginny watching from across the eggs, and she had thought, poor dear. She had thought she understood the shape of it. She had not understood the shape of it. She was looking at it now, in a garden in August, in an old shirt 2 sizes too large on a 12-year-old boy who ate breakfast like someone counting each mouthful against a quota he hadn't set himself. She wished she had sent more letters. She wished she had sent them sooner, before September, before there had been a sweater or a correspondence or anything, though she knew this didn't make sense. She hadn't known him in September, and the shape of a thing was easier to see from the far side of it. She wished she had done more. She would not say this to Harry. It wasn't his job to carry her regret about his own situation. She put another piece of toast on his plate and went back to the stove. Arthur came down at 7:30 and redirected his opening remarks within 30 seconds into an enthusiastic series of questions about Muggle appliances. Ginny, in her dressing gown, appeared in the doorway behind him, looked at Harry, and went completely silent. Harry answered Arthur's questions with the focused attention of someone who had learned Muggle things by necessity and knew them thoroughly. Fred and George had already gone to bed. The kitchen was loud and warm and slightly cramped, with the chairs not quite matching and the ceiling low and the smell of breakfast still heavy in the air. The garden outside the window was going gold with the early light. Harry sat at the table in the middle of it and tried to find a name for what he was feeling. He couldn't locate one. He sat with the unnamed feeling and drank his tea and let Arthur ask him about the combustion engine. And the morning did what mornings in that kitchen apparently did, which was proceed in the cheerful, slightly chaotic, inexhaustible way of a place that had been doing this for a long time and intended to continue. He had been at the Burrow for a week, which was long enough to know which chair was Arthur's, and which mug was Percy's, and which step on the staircase creaked at a pitch that suggested genuine structural opinions about being stepped on. Long enough to know that the kitchen was the center of gravity, and that most things in this house were resolved or at least circled around there. Long enough to find himself knowing where the teapot was without looking. He had not asked the question. He had been not asking it since Christmas in the way that you orbit something you're not sure you're allowed to approach, keeping it in the peripheral, doing everything except looking at it directly. He had said, "thank you," in letters more than once. And he had meant it, and the thank you was real. But thank you was not the same as the question. The question was different. The question required naming the thing, and naming it required deciding it was his to name. And he wasn't entirely sure of that yet. On the 8th evening, he was in the garden with Molly when the question came out. She was denoming, which was a phrase Harry had learned 3 days ago, and which turned out to describe the process of removing garden gnomes from the flower beds by seizing them, spinning them with some momentum, and releasing them over the hedge. The gnomes made a sound when they landed in the field beyond, which could be categorized as either a complaint or a greeting, depending on your relationship to the gnome problem. Molly did it with the efficient focus of someone performing a household task she had performed many times and expected to perform many times more. Harry had been helping or attempting to help. The gnomes were faster than they looked and had opinions about being seized that they expressed at full volume. He didn't plan it. He had the gnome in his hands, and Molly was a few feet away, and it came out the way things came out when you had been not saying them for a long time, and the moment caught you unprepared. "Why did you send it?" he said. "The sweater. Before you knew me." Molly looked at him. The gnome in her hands gnawed thoughtfully at her glove. "Sit down," she said. "The gnomes can wait." She sat on the low garden bench, and Harry sat beside her, and the evening light was gold on the hedges, and the gnomes in the corners of the garden regarded them both with a territorial wariness that suggested they were reconsidering their position. "Your brother Percy wrote to me," Harry said. "In October. He told me about it, that he'd written, last spring." "That's right," Molly said. "He wrote and told me there was a boy in Gryffindor who hadn't received a single letter since term began. He called you." She paused. "He said he'd come to think of you, privately, as the boy who never got post." "That's what he wrote in the letter, those exact words." "He's very precise, Percy." Something in her voice when she said this was fond in the complicated way you were fond of a person who expressed themselves in a form that was not your form, but was undeniably theirs. "He would not have written if he hadn't decided it was worth writing. He told me he thought I should know." She was quiet for a moment. "I knew who you were the second I read the name. You'd been at the platform. I'd helped you through the barrier. I remembered you." Harry nodded. He had not known this. He had known she knew his name. He had not known she remembered him specifically. "I asked myself why I was going to do something about it," Molly said. "I sat at the kitchen table and I asked myself, and the answer I gave myself was various sensible things about extra wool and Christmas being coming and it not being any trouble. Those were the reasons I told myself." She looked at the hedge. "They were not the actual reason." He waited. "I had 2 brothers," she said. "Older than me. They were killed in the war, you know whose first rise, not recently, 27 years ago now." She said it with the particular flatness of people who have had a very long time to absorb something and have decided that the absorption is complete even when it isn't quite. 5 Death Eaters, they said afterward. It took 5 of them. My brothers were not people who lost easily." Harry did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been the right thing. "When the war ended," Molly said, "we learned what had been lost, and we learned what was left. There were children who'd grown up on the wrong side of what happened, parents gone, no one to explain anything, the world expecting things from them that they hadn't asked to be expected of. I knew that was true. I thought about it when you know who fell." She stopped and then corrected herself and said the name plainly. "When Voldemort fell, I thought about the children." She looked at Harry then, directly. "Percy's letter told me where to send the wool. That's all it did. I had already known I would if I ever found out. He just told me where to look." Harry sat with this. He had been a problem before. For the Dursleys, he had been an inconvenient fact of life, something imposed on them, requiring management, costing effort they hadn't agreed to. For the wizarding world, he was a story that had been running without him since before he could remember, a symbol that existed at a remove from any actual person he was. He had been, presumably, an obligation for various people who made decisions about where he went and what happened to him. He had been a lot of things. He had not been the reason someone picked up knitting needles. He had not been to anyone the thing that made the decision obvious. He stared at the hedge for a moment, and the gnomes stared back, beady-eyed and not particularly sympathetic, which was fine because sympathy was not what this required. "Did you know my mum?" he asked. "Or did you know who she was?" Molly considered this. "I knew of her," she said. "The way people knew each other from that time, when so many people were involved in the same circumstances. Not well. I didn't know her well. I've seen photographs." She paused. She had very kind eyes. In the photographs. Harry had heard this said before. It was the thing people said about Lily Potter when they were trying to say something true and ran into the limits of what they knew, and he had learned to receive it as a fact about his mother rather than as a fact about the person saying it. He received it this way now, and then he received it a second time, more slowly, and understood that it was also something else. Molly was not only telling him what Lily had looked like, she was telling him that she was looking at him, that she could see the line between the woman in the photographs and the boy on the garden bench, that she was saying, "I see where you come from, and I see who is here, and I am not confusing the two." It was different. It was different from the other times. He opened his mouth to say something and did not manage it, which was fine, because from the far end of the garden, Ginny fell off the fence. It was not a serious fall. She had been climbing the garden fence with the experimental confidence of someone who had grown up in this garden and felt she had established adequate credit with it, and she had not. But it produced the sound of Ginny landing in the border flower bed, and then the sound of Ginny expressing her views on this outcome at considerable volume. From inside, Arthur called something about dinner that carried the urgency of a person who had just remembered the oven. The evening reasserted itself. Molly stood. She put her hand on Harry's arm. Brief, one moment, a squeeze. And then she went inside, and the kitchen light came on behind the window, and Harry could hear her voice through the glass, doing what her voice did in kitchens, which was organize. He did not move from the bench. The gnomes, reassessing the situation, began filtering back into the flower beds in their stubby, resentful way. Ginny extracted herself from the flower bed and went inside without looking at Harry, which was probably because she had fallen off a fence in front of him and needed to process this privately. Somewhere in the upper part of the house, Fred and George were doing something that produced a periodic thumping sound at intervals too regular to be accidental. The burrow went about its evening. Harry sat in the garden in the gold light and did not name what had settled in him because it didn't need a name. It was there. It had been looking for a place to land for a long time, and now it had landed, and it sat in him with the weight of something that was exactly the right size for the space it had been given. He stayed until Molly called him in for dinner, and then he went inside. A year ago, Harry had stood on this platform not knowing where to go. He had known the train was somewhere. He had known the number 9 3/4, and he had stood in the middle of King's Cross with a trolley and an owl and no understanding of how to get from the number to the train. And he had looked at the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 with the particular look of someone who has received information but not the instructions that go with it. A family had saved him. He had overheard Molly Weasley say muggles and had followed the sound of her voice toward the barrier, and she had helped him through without being asked, without knowing who he was, without any reason, except that a child was clearly lost, and she was the sort of person who noticed that. He was not lost this year. This year the platform was a controlled chaos around him that he was somehow inside rather than outside of. Molly had checked whether he'd eaten breakfast before they'd even got through the barrier, which he had, twice in the end, and Percy was giving Fred and George a formally worded briefing on the standards of behavior expected of second years that Fred and George were receiving with the expressions of people who had been given a great gift. Ron was already trying to get his cauldron on the trolley without losing his rat. Someone had the trolley at the wrong angle. Someone else was arguing about it. Harry pushed his own trolley through the middle of all of this and felt, in a way he had no previous experience of, and therefore no language for, that he was in the right place. Ginny was at the edge of it, which was where Ginny had been since they arrived, maintaining her position at the periphery of the family group with the determined calm of someone who was feeling approximately 17 things at once and had decided that being at the periphery was safer than being at the center. She was wearing new school robes, and she had her trunk beside her, and she was looking at the train with the fixed expression of someone who had prepared for this moment all summer and was now confronting the gap between preparation and the fact. She looked at Harry once and then looked sharply away, which was the thing she had been doing since August, which was, he was Harry Potter. She had grown up knowing his name, and then he had spent a week at the burrow eating her mother's food and explaining petrol engines to her father and learning which stair creaked. And these two versions of the same person had not yet resolved into a single category she could manage. Harry found this slightly funny, which he did not express, because he had been on the other side of an impossible category problem, and it was not the sort of thing you made jokes about. "Right," Molly said, appearing at his elbow in the decisive way she appeared places. "Let me just check your trunk." "It's fine. I packed me." She had already opened it. She examined its contents with the rapid expert assessment of someone who had packed school trunks many times and knew the taxonomy of what was missing. She said nothing about the box of shortbread wrapped in brown paper at the top, which Harry had not packed and had therefore not put there, and which had arrived in the trunk between the hall and the platform in the way that things arrived in trunks when Molly Weasley had access to them. She closed the trunk. She did not mention the shortbread. He did not mention the shortbread. This seemed to be how that was going to work. Arthur materialized on Harry's other side with the particular focused energy of a man who had been waiting to ask a question and had now identified his opportunity. "Harry, zip," he said. "Now, I've been thinking about this. The teeth." He made a motion with his fingers that indicated the mechanism. They interlock, and then the pull tab moves them into position. I understand the principle. What I cannot determine is whether each tooth is a separate piece or whether the whole thing is manufactured as one continuous unit, because when I examined one last Thursday, the teeth appeared to be— "They're separate," Harry said. "There's a slider that pushes them together. It's stamped out of metal, usually, in production." Arthur looked at him with the expression he reserved for Muggle mechanical facts, which was the expression of someone receiving a sacred text. "Stamped," he repeated, "from a single sheet of metal." "Usually, yes." Arthur said nothing for a moment, absorbing this with the reverence it apparently warranted. "Extraordinary," he said quietly. He was going to think about zips for the rest of the day. This was clear from his face. Fred and George were already on the train with the efficiency of people who had timed their departure to coincide exactly with the moment before they could be given any more instructions. Ron had his trolley sorted and was moving toward the carriages with Hermione, who had appeared from somewhere in the crowd with perfect timing and was exchanging a rapid summary of summer reading with him that Ron was receiving with the expression of someone waiting politely for a different conversation to start. Ginny watched her brothers board and then squared her shoulders and began moving with the deliberate purpose of someone who had decided that forward was the only available direction. Harry turned to say something to Molly. He had been going to say something practical. "See you at Christmas," or "Thank you for the shortbread," something in the register of the ordinary. And she hugged him. She was short, and he had a few inches on her now, and her arms came around him with the decisive completeness of someone who had decided this was happening and had committed to it. He did not know what to do with his arms. He stood for a moment with them at his sides, and then he put them around her, because that was what you did. Because the alternative was just standing there being hugged at, and the hug was brief. It was over in a few seconds, and it was the longest hug of his life, which was not something he thought about until later, and then thought about for quite a long time. "Right when you arrive," she said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight, so I know you're safe." "I will," he said. "And eat properly. Not just the things Ron eats on the train. Those are sweets." "I know." "Good," she said, and let go, and he got on the train. From the platform, Molly watched them go. She had seen this train leave before, 6 times now, and every time it was both the same and different in the way of things that accumulated meaning each pass. This time, she watched the window where Harry had appeared. He'd found a compartment quickly. He knew where to look now. And she watched the train begin to move with the slow intention of something large and unhurried that intended to be somewhere else by the time the day was done. A year ago, September, she had seen a boy standing in the middle of this station who didn't know how the barrier worked. He'd been thin and alone and managing his trolley with the quiet independence of someone who had been managing things alone for a long time. She had helped him through because of course she had, because what else did you do when a child was lost? She hadn't known, doing it, that Percy was going to write to her in October. She hadn't known about the letters or the sweater or the summer or any of the shape it would all take. She thought, well, good then. The train moved south and east and gathered speed, and she watched until the platform had nothing left on it that was moving away from her, and then her eyes stung, which was annoying, because she was not the sort of person who— she was, apparently, the sort of person who— just briefly. She pressed her fingers to the corner of her eye. Arthur's hand found hers without him saying anything about it, which was exactly what Arthur would do, and she held on to it, and they stayed until the end of the platform was empty, and the sound of the train had gone. Then she turned around and went home. The platform noise faded as the train moved south, and then it was just the rhythm of the wheels and the changing light and the 3 of them in the compartment. Ginny was sitting very straight. She had been sitting very straight since King's Cross, with her hands in her lap and her eyes doing the thing where they moved between the window and the compartment door and back, cataloging. She was not speaking, which was unusual for Ginny, who in Harry's experience of her had views on most subjects and expressed them freely. She had clearly identified this moment as one that required a different approach. She was applying composure with both hands, and it was working, mostly, except for the straightness of the sitting. Ron was eating the first of what would probably be several pasties, unconcerned with the landscape or the occasion in the comfortable way of someone returning to a place they already knew. Harry had a letter in his pocket. Molly had given it to him on the platform, pressed it into his hand at the last moment, just before the whistle, with the instruction not to open it until the train was moving. He'd put it in his jacket pocket with his fingers around it without looking at it, because she'd said not to, and he had got on the train, and now the train was moving. He unfolded it. She had written it in her kitchen handwriting, which was different from her letters to school handwriting in a way he had come to recognize. Slightly faster, the loops a little looser, written at the kitchen table probably, with the noise of the house in the background. She said she'd wanted to write some things that she'd not been able to say on the platform because the platform had been exactly what it always was, which was loud and full of people who all needed something at the same time. She wrote that she was glad Percy had written to her. She wrote this simply, without expanding on it, just that she was glad. That she'd thought about that letter many times in the year since, and had never been sorry he'd sent it. She wrote that she was glad Harry had written back. She said the thank you letter had arrived and she'd read it twice and written back the same afternoon, which he already knew. But she was saying it again because she wanted him to know that she'd read it twice, and not because she was slow, but because she hadn't wanted to miss anything. Then she wrote. The sweater was easy. She'd made hundreds of them. She knew that pattern without looking at the needles. But the not knowing, how he would receive it, what he would think, whether a sweater from someone he'd met for 5 minutes on a platform was going to land right or wrong or somewhere in between she couldn't predict, had been the hardest thing she had done in years. She had knitted the whole thing not knowing. She had sent it not knowing. She had signed it Molly, and added below that, in smaller letters, "Thank you for writing back. I am very glad you did." Harry read the letter to the end, and then he sat for a moment with the sound of the wheels and the countryside happening outside the window. He read it again. On the second reading, he found the not knowing. He had read it the first time and understood it, and then it had slid through him, and now he found it again more slowly, and this time he understood what it was. She had been afraid too. She had been uncertain too, whether the gesture would land, whether it would be wanted, whether a child who had never been sent anything would receive a sweater from a stranger as a kindness or as something harder to accept, something that cost more than it gave. She had not known. She had sent it not knowing. He had spent 4 days trying to write a thank you letter. He had written and rewritten and eventually sent the shortest possible version before he lost his nerve, because he hadn't known how to speak to someone who had chosen him. And she had sent the sweater not knowing if he'd be able to receive it at all. Both of them not knowing. Both of them doing it anyway. He folded the letter. He put it back in his pocket. He knew she would write when he got to school. She had already said so on the platform, in the list of things she'd told him to do, which included write when you arrive and eat properly, and she'd added at the end, almost as an afterthought, just I write. She would write back. This was how it worked now. He knew the shape of it. Across the compartment, Ginny had abandoned the composure attempt and was now looking openly out the window with the expression of someone experiencing genuine wonder that she was slightly annoyed to be experiencing where people could see her. The fields were going by very fast in the way they only did from trains, and the sky was that particular September shade that was not quite summer and not quite anything else. Ron had started on the second pasty and was explaining something about the Chudley cannons to no one in particular, which Ginny was not listening to, which did not appear to discourage him. Hedwig was on the rack above Harry's head in her cage, watching him with her amber eyes. She had the specific patient quality of a creature that had been waiting for a long time and had recently stopped having to wait quite as much and was still processing what to do with the change. A year ago, she had been in the owlery with no one to carry letters for, and Harry had visited her in the evenings because there was nothing else to send her to do. She had places now. She had routes she knew. The trunk was under the seat. Harry could see the corner of it from where he was sitting. He had packed it himself this time, which he had also done last year, but this time he'd known what he was doing and had made choices about what went where. The sweater was at the top. He'd folded it carefully and placed it at the top of the trunk, on top of everything else, where he could get to it without unpacking anything. Emerald green, H on the front, the wool still dense and warm from its first winter. He'd held it for a moment before he put it in the trunk, and then he'd put it in the trunk, because the burrow was not a place where you stood holding things for too long without someone coming to ask if you were all right. It was at the top. He'd know where it was. The train carried them north by northwest, through the September afternoon, through England, through the particular landscape of a country that was full of ordinary things that also, if you knew where to look, contained extraordinary ones. Ginny had fallen asleep against Ron's shoulder at some point in the last hour, which was either very brave or completely unremarkable depending on where you were standing, and Ron had carefully not moved in the way of someone who had younger siblings and knew the rules. The compartment was warm and quiet and entirely ordinary. Harry sat with his hand in his pocket, where the letter was. He was not nothing. He had not been nothing. Not since October. Not since a screech owl had left the Hogwarts owlery in the dark and flown west to Devon, and everything that followed had followed. Not since Percy Weasley had sat down at his prefect's desk in the second week of October and picked up a quill and, for reasons he had categorized as professional and which had been entirely something else, written home about the boy who never got post. Harry looked at Hedwig. Hedwig looked at Harry. Outside the window, England moved past in the afternoon light, and the train moved through it, and the sweater was folded at the top of the trunk where he could find it easily, and it was, in all the ways that mattered, the first day